Nannie Doss was born Nancy Hazel on November 4th, 1905, in the small town of Blue Mountain, Alabama. Life in the Hazel household was hard. Her father, James Hazel, was a strict and often cruel man who kept his children under tight control. Education was not a priority. Instead, Nannie and her siblings spent their days working on the family farm. Any childhood innocence she might have had was stripped away by labor and fear. Her only escape was the glossy pages of romance magazines, filled with stories of passion and devotion, worlds away from the reality she knew. But even as a child, there were signs that something was different about Nannie. A train accident at the age of 7 left her with a severe head injury, causing blackouts and unpredictable mood swings for years to come. Some would later speculate that this injury had affected her brain, possibly playing a role in what would become her chilling future.
By the time she was a teenager, Nannie was desperate to escape her father's home. At just 16, she was married off to Charlie Braggs, a young factory worker. At first, she thought she had finally found the romance she had always dreamed of. But Charlie was not the devoted husband she had hoped for. He was unfaithful, often drinking and staying out late. To make matters worse, his mother, overbearing and cruel, lived with them and made Nannie's life miserable.
Still, Nannie stayed, bearing 4 children in rapid succession. The strain of motherhood, a troubled marriage, and her suffocating home life took its toll. Then tragedy struck, or so it seemed. In 1927, 2 of Nannie's young daughters died suddenly and without explanation. The doctors ruled it as food poisoning, but Charlie wasn't convinced. Fearing for his own life, he took their eldest daughter and fled, leaving Nannie and their newborn behind. Charlie would later say she was a good housekeeper, but she loved those romance stories more than reality. Alone once again, Nannie turned to the thing that had always given her comfort: romance magazines. In their classified sections, lonely hearts posted personal ads, searching for love. That was how she met Frank Harrelson, her second husband. He was everything she thought she wanted: charming, affectionate, and poetic in his letters. They married quickly, and for a time it seemed as if Nannie had finally found happiness. But Frank had a dark side. He was a heavy drinker with a violent temper, and soon Nannie found herself trapped in yet another nightmare. She endured the abuse for years, until one night in 1945, when she had had enough. As Frank drank his usual glass of whiskey, Nannie watched him closely. What he didn't know was that his drink had been laced with rat poison. Within hours, Frank was dead. Authorities chalked it up to alcohol poisoning, and Nannie moved on, once again a grieving widow, one who had conveniently rid herself of another disappointment. Her pattern continued. Through the personal ads, she found her third husband, Arlie Lanning. Arlie was a heavy drinker as well, but Nannie had learned patience. She played the perfect, devoted wife, waiting for the right moment. In 1952, after only a few years of marriage, Arlie fell ill and died suddenly. This time, Nannie ensured there would be no suspicions. Shortly after his death, their house mysteriously burned down, leaving Nannie free to collect the insurance money and move on to her next victim. Her fourth husband, Richard Morton, met a similar fate. By now, Nannie had perfected her craft. She poisoned him slowly, ensuring that his death seemed natural. But in the meantime, she also found time to kill her own mother, Louisa, who had recently moved in with her. Whether it was out of convenience or simply because Nannie had grown bored, no one would ever know. By 1953, Nannie had married her final husband, Samuel Doss, a conservative and religious man who disapproved of her romance novels and frivolous ways. Unlike the others, Samuel was strict and disciplined. He controlled how Nannie spent money, how she lived, even what she read. He insisted on an orderly home, free of the nonsense she adored. It was clear that he would not last long. At first, she poisoned him in small doses, just enough to make him sick. When he was hospitalized, doctors managed to save his life. He recovered and was sent home, unaware that his wife had been the cause of his suffering. But Nannie wasn't done. Within days of his return, she served him a meal laced with arsenic, and this time, he didn't survive. Unlike her previous victims, Samuel's death raised red flags. Doctors, suspicious of how quickly he had fallen ill again, ordered an autopsy. Their findings shocked them. Samuel had been poisoned. Authorities were called, and soon the investigation turned to his ever-smiling widow. When questioned, Nannie laughed. She confessed without hesitation, recounting each poisoning as if she were discussing mundane household chores. "I just wanted love," she said with a giggle. "That's all I ever wanted." Her cheerful demeanor horrified investigators. How could a woman who looked like everyone's loving grandmother be capable of such heartless killings? But Nannie saw herself not as a murderer, but as a woman searching for happiness. Happiness that always seemed to slip through her fingers, requiring her to remove the obstacles in her way. News of her crimes spread like wildfire. The press gave her a chilling nickname, the Giggling Granny. The public was fascinated by her case, unable to reconcile the image of a kindly old woman with that of a serial killer who had poisoned those closest to her. In court, Nannie showed no remorse. She was sentenced to life in prison, spared the death penalty only because of her gender. Even behind bars, she remained cheerful, often entertaining guards and inmates with jokes. She spent the rest of her days in prison until she died of leukemia in 1965. The story of Nannie Doss remains one of the most bizarre and unsettling in true crime history. Was she a victim of a cruel childhood, searching endlessly for the love she had never received? Or was she a cold, calculating killer who simply enjoyed getting rid of those who disappointed her? One thing is certain. Behind the soft giggles and kind smile of Nannie Doss lurked a darkness that no one saw coming until it was far too late.